Hello, everybody. I'm here with Chapter 7 of Book 3 of the Royal Rangers series, Duel at Araluen. Let's go ahead and get into it. Horace was sitting in his tent, out of the heat of the noonday sun, sharpening his sword, when Gillen poked his head around the open entrance. "Isn't that thing sharp enough already?" he said, as Horace rasped away at the gleaming blade. Horace studied the sword as he worked. It had been made by the famed sword makers of Nihanja, and had been presented to him many years before. The blade was not only sharp, it was incredibly hard. It would put a notch in the blade of a normal Araluen sword. The steel was slightly blue, with wave-like patterns running along it, showing where the separate rods of iron had been beaten together to form it. "A sword can never be too sharp," he said. "What's on your mind?" "I've had an idea," Gillen said. Horace looked up with interest, the whetstone pausing in its rhythmic back-and-forth stroking of the blade. "Of course, that's what you Rangers do. You have ideas, you think, you plan, whereas simple warriors like me just look for their next opportunity to whack someone with a sword." "If you've quite finished," Gillen replied. "I take it this idea of yours is a brilliant plan to break out of here and send that rabble down the hill packing?" Horace continued. "If so, it's taken you long enough to come up with it." "It's not exactly that," Gillen said, and Horace feigned a look of disappointment. "But it is related. Come with me." He turned and stooped under the entrance to the tent, moving out into the bright sunshine. When Horace followed, a few seconds later, the ranger was already striding toward the north wall. Horace lengthened his stride to catch up. "So this idea of yours concerns the back of the fort?" Gillen said nothing. He mounted the rickety stairs that led to the catwalk inside the north wall and climbed to the top. Once there, he moved to the parapet and turned to face Horace. "It strikes me," he said, "that there may come a time when we want to leave the fort, and possibly launch an attack on the enemy camp." He gestured with his thumb toward the south wall, where the main gate was placed, and the camp that lay downhill behind it. "Since we've discussed that idea several times, I wouldn't be surprised," Horace replied. "All we need is a plan, a typically sneaky, underhand ranger type of plan. And if we were to do such a thing, it would be better if the enemy didn't see us coming. At least, not immediately." Horace nodded. "That would make sense. I'm assuming you're thinking that we might leave the fort via the north side. But as you can see, there is no gate in this north wall, and not a lot of room on the pathway below it. Certainly not a lot of room for our horses." He gestured down to the track that wound around the fort. At its highest point, it was barely a meter wide. Chances were, if they tried to take horses out onto that narrow dirt track, they would stumble and fall. Gillen nodded. "I noticed that. My idea is that we build a ramp." "A ramp?" Horace said. "A sloping timber walkway that we could lead the horses down." Horace gave him an exasperated look. "I wasn't asking for a definition of a ramp," he said. "I was expressing surprise at the idea, perhaps even admiration. We'd have to make a hole in the wall, of course, a hole that we might call a gateway," Gillen explained further. "That wouldn't be too hard." "And where would you see this ramp going?" Horace asked. Gillen pointed to the next level down on the sloping path. "Down to the next level," he said. At the point he indicated, the pathway was several meters wide, with plenty of room for mounted riders. We could ride down the ramp to the path, then work our way around the hill, and emerge on the other side of the fort, 2 levels down. We'd be that much closer to the enemy before they saw us." Horace leaned on the rough timber wall, visualizing such a ramp. "It's a good idea," he said. "Thank you," Gillen said, with just a trace of smugness. Then Horace continued, But there are two problems. One, where will you get the timber for this ramp? There's not a lot lying around. You're standing on it, Gillen told him. We could tear up this walkway and the stairs to build the ramp. But then we'd have no defensive position if the enemy attacked this side of the fort, Horace pointed out. Gillen nodded. On the other hand, if they did attack this wall and made it to the top, they'd be faced with a 4-meter drop into the compound below, wouldn't they? Horace smiled. He hadn't thought of that. He visualized the surprised look on the attackers' faces as they swung themselves over the top of the parapet and found nothing below them but thin air. In addition to that, my archers could engage them from the walkways on the east and west walls and shoot down any who didn't fall. Yes, Horace said slowly, now picturing this further concept. You said there were two problems with my plan? Horace reluctantly abandoned his thoughts of Sonderland mercenaries tumbling to the hard-packed earth below, riddled with arrows. So I did. The other problem, or problems to be more exact, is down there. He pointed down the hill, where the winding path formed a series of steep terraces, to a small group of tents at the bottom. They could see smoke from a cooking fire rising into the air, and a figure moving from one of the tents to the fire. Unfortunately, our enemy isn't completely lacking in intelligence, he said. Those lookouts are there to raise the alarm if we do try to leave the fort from this side. Actually, I had thought of that, Gillen said. Horace looked at him. He wasn't surprised to hear it. Gillen wasn't the type to overlook such a basic hole in his plan. And did you think of a solution? By the time they make their way around the base of the hill to raise the alarm, our cavalry will be in sight anyway. You're right, Horace said thoughtfully. We wouldn't achieve total surprise, of course. They'd still see us coming down the last 2/3 of the hill, but we'd be a lot closer to them than if we were to sortie through the main gate. Exactly, Gillen said, and I can lead the archers out the main gate and down the south side of the hill, while you lead the cavalry at a canter around the track. It won't be a complete surprise, as you say, but it might be enough to panic and confuse them when they see us coming. And panic and confusion here are our allies in this situation, Horace agreed. He came to a decision and slapped his friend on the shoulder. Gillen, who was slight of build, like most rangers, staggered a pace or two. I'm glad you like the idea, he said sourly. A trebuchet, you say? Duncan asked Cassandra. He was sitting up in his bed, which had been placed against the window of his room, affording a view over the parkland below the castle. Since they had taken refuge in the tower, Cassandra had made a practice of visiting her father and keeping him abreast of events. She valued his comments and advice. After all, he was an experienced commander and one of Araluen's foremost tacticians. She, on the other hand, was new to the business of commanding men in battle. She nodded now at his question. That's what it looks like. I've never seen one in real life, but I've seen pictures of them. He frowned thoughtfully. And where is it now? It's in the courtyard. Damon's men abandoned it when our archers started shooting. I can hear them hammering and sawing on the other side of the keep. I assume they're building some kind of timber shield to protect the crew from our arrows. Duncan started to throw back the blankets covering his legs. Well, let's take a look at it. But she held out a hand to stop him. Dad, you're a sick man. Don't try to get up. Nonsense, Duncan said emphatically, brushing aside her protests. Lying here with nothing to do is making me sick. I feel useless and inadequate. Best thing for me would be to have something to occupy my mind. He swung his legs out of bed, moving carefully to favor the injured leg, and pulled on a pair of breeches, stuffing his nightshirt into them. Cassandra regarded her father curiously. He seemed to have a new energy about him. he was different from the pale, wan figure she had become accustomed to. There was color back in his cheeks, and, although he was still thin, he definitely seemed to have regained some of his old vigor. Perhaps he was right, she thought. He needed a challenge. He needed something to do. Most of all, he needed to feel useful. She helped him rise from the bed. He swayed uncertainly for a moment or two, then recovered his sense of balance. "Been lying there too long," he said brusquely. "Hand me my stick." There was a blackthorn walking stick leaning against the wardrobe, and she passed it to him. He leaned his weight on it, and took an experimental step toward the door. He swayed again, then beckoned to her. "Better let me lean on you to start," he said, and she moved quickly to him, letting him put his arm around her shoulders. He beamed at her. "Now lead on." They made their way to the door leading to the balcony, followed by the curious and delighted looks of those they passed on the way. The soldiers were heartened by the sight of the king on his feet once more, and they murmured greetings and touched their knuckles to their foreheads as he passed. Duncan paused at the door and looked back at them. "The old dog still has some life in him," he told them, grinning. He was answered by smiles, and one anonymous voice that called, "Good on you, Bandy-Legs." It was the Army's private nickname for him, referring to the fact that, after a lifetime in the saddle, he was a trifle bow-legged. He pretended to frown angrily, even though he had been aware of the nickname for many years. "Insolence!" he snorted, then turned toward the doorway. "Let's take a look at this machine, shall we?" On the balcony, he released his grip on Cassandra's shoulder, and they leaned on the balustrade together, peering down into the courtyard. He was silent for several seconds. "Yes, it's a trebuchet, all right," he said, "and it looks rather well made. Damon obviously has an engineer among his men." He peered more closely, framing his hands around his eyes to help him focus on the trebuchet. He said thoughtfully. She looked quickly at him. "What is it?" she asked. He pointed down into the courtyard. "The rope they're using. It's coated with tar." She frowned, not seeing the significance. "That's normal, isn't it?" she asked. "I assume they do that to stop it fraying." "Yes, it's quite normal. But usually the rope on a trebuchet is old, and the tar has dried and hardened. This is newly applied. It's fresh." He paused for a few seconds, then added, "and flammable." Slowly, the significance of what he was saying dawned on her. "So, if we were to hit it with fire arrows," she said, "it would probably burn quite nicely." He smiled at her. "Exactly." Cassandra turned away to the door. "Merlon," she called. The old sergeant appeared almost immediately. "Yes, my lady?" he replied. She gestured to the interior of the tower behind him. "Get those archers out here again, will you?" He nodded and disappeared back into the tower room. She could hear him calling out as he went. He reappeared with the archers a few minutes later. Cassandra beckoned to them to join her at the balustrade, then looked expectantly to her father, waiting for him to explain what they had in mind. Duncan took her arm and, limping still, led her a few paces away, then spoke softly to her. "You're in command," he told her. "You need to tell them what to do. I don't want the men looking to me every time you give an order to see if I approve. You need to appear confident and positive." Cassandra nodded and moved back to where the archers were waiting. Duncan remained where he was. She pointed to the trebuchet in the courtyard below. "The rope on that windlass is freshly tarred," she said. "The tar is still soft and wet. That means it's highly flammable." They all nodded, beginning to see where she was going. "Do you think you could?" Duncan cleared his throat meaningfully behind her, and she recalled what he had said about being positive and confident. I want you to put a few fire arrows into that rope, she amended. I want you to set it on fire. Delighted grins spread across the three men's faces. No problem at all, my lady, Thomas, the senior among them, replied. The others murmured agreement. You have a wicked mind, my lady, Thomas continued. She shrugged, taking the comment as a compliment. Merlin snapped his fingers at the three archers. You start preparing some fire arrows, he said. I'll go fetch a brazier. All right, that's going to be the end of Chapter 7. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you next time in Chapter 8. God bless, and have a good one.